I explained the Electoral College in class or on the last lecture, but we didn't really get into what are the problems with the Electoral College, because there are some. At least there's a number of things that people say, well, this is why we should get rid of it. There's some weaknesses here. However, I don't think that we're going to get rid of it. For a couple of reasons that I'll explain later, it seems like the Electoral College is ours to stay. So let's look at the potential problems that Electoral College has. First of all, let's start with winner take all. What we mean by winner take all is whoever wins the state gets all the electoral votes. The loser doesn't get any. And this is true in all but 2 states. 48 states use this method. So that means if you win the state of South Dakota, you get those 3 electoral votes. The loser gets 0 electoral votes. You win California, you get 55. The loser gets 0. But the reality of it is maybe somebody wins a state, let's say 51 to 49% of the popular vote. So the loser, actually 49% of the people of that state voted for the loser. However, that loser gets 0 electoral votes. The winner gets 100%. It seems fundamentally wrong that we use the winner-take-all method, but we do, and that's a part of the problem, or that's something that leads to other problems. There are 2 states, Nebraska and Maine, that do not. They divide, or it is possible in those 2 states to divide electoral votes up. Nebraska has 5, and it's possible for somebody to win all 5, but it's also possible for them to be split 4-1 and 3-2. Okay, Maine has 4, and I believe Maine could be split up 4-0 or 3-1. They wouldn't evenly divide them out. And that's up to each state to determine their method. So it doesn't have to be winner take all. That's not in the Constitution. But that's where it is in all but 2 states. And the other states haven't really put a whole lot of push in changing that. So I don't see that changing either. Now, with that winner take all, it is possible to get the most popular votes and still lose the election. That's happened a few times in our history. And let me explain to you how that could possibly be. Let's say that we have 2 candidates, candidate A and candidate B. And let's just use a few states here. Let's say that the popular vote in California, we'll say candidate A gets 15 million votes, candidate B 14 million. It's very close, but candidate A won. Candidate A gets all 55 of the electoral votes. Candidate B, 0. Texas, let's say 2 to 8 million, so candidate B gets those 38 electoral votes. In Georgia, we'll say 3 to 4 million apiece, and again, candidate B gets them all. So it's a fairly close election, but the losers of a state are getting 0 electoral votes. Minnesota, we'll say candidate A got 10, got the 10 electoral votes because they won by a couple million votes. Okay, so just using these 4 states, we see that if we look at popular vote, candidate A has 23 million. Candidate B is winning with 27 million popular votes. However, if we look at the electoral votes, candidate A is leading in the electoral vote column. If an election is close enough, it is possible that the candidate who receives the most popular votes actually loses the presidential election because they don't get enough electoral votes. And look at the 2000 election. In the 2000 presidential election, Al Gore received 50,992,000 votes. George Bush received 50,455,000 votes. But there's never been a President Gore. Bush won the presidential election even though he had fewer popular votes. He did win the electoral vote. I think he had 271 electoral votes. I mean, you barely won, but you don't have to win by a bunch. You just have to win the majority of electoral votes. So it has happened there, and it's happened 3 other times, in 1876, in 1888, and 1824. So there have been 4 times in American history when the person who has received the most popular votes actually lost the election, which, again, if we go by a democratic system, it seems like you would give the votes or the election to whoever gets the most votes. With the Electoral College, it's possible to get the most votes and still lose, mostly because of the winner-take-all. Now, here's the other thing. The House gets to decide if no majority is reached. So this has been used a couple times in American history. So if nobody gets that 270, the magic number of today, it goes to the House of Representatives. Now, granted, this hasn't happened for a long time, and it's unlikely to happen as long as we only have two major candidates getting votes. But if we ever have a third-party candidate who gets a lot of votes, it's certainly possible that no candidate would get the majority of electoral votes. And then it goes to the House. Well, there's 435 members of the House. You probably have 120, 140 million people vote in an election. And we're saying that those 435 get to choose for the 120, 140 million people that actually voted in an election. I'm pretty sure they'll vote along party lines, so it's hard to say. But I don't think that this maybe is the fairest way to choose the president. Now, granted, this hasn't happened much. It hasn't happened since 1824 when John Quincy Adams was chosen president. Thomas Jefferson was also chosen this way. It is unlikely to happen again as long as we only have the two major parties that are winning electoral votes. And since no other candidate has won an electoral vote, I believe, since the 70s, 1972, or it might have been in the 60s, it's unlikely that this will be a factor, but it's still a potential problem. Your vote only counts within your state, meaning that if you live in a state that is predominantly one party or the other, you may feel disenfranchised, at least for voting for president. In South Dakota is a good example. South Dakota has more registered Republicans than we have Democrats in the state. So if you're a Democrat in South Dakota, you may feel like you never get a chance to elect a president, that your state is always going to go to the Republican candidate. Let me show you a graph of South Dakota's elections here. Give me a second. I don't know. Well, let me try to explain this. If your state is predominantly one party, you may feel like you never get a say. Here we go. This is South Dakota's presidential election. Obviously, this doesn't count here because they haven't an election yet. But you have to go back to 1964, since a Democrat has won the state of South Dakota. And then prior to that, we have, Republicans winning too. So if you are a Democrat in South Dakota, you may feel like your vote doesn't really count because the vote only goes within the state. If votes were gone as total popular vote, then your vote, even though you're losing the state, would feel like, all right, it's still going in the total vote count of my candidate. And there are a number of states that are predominantly Republican and a number of states that were predominantly Democrat. And those states that we can oftentimes predict how they will vote for president. And in those states, the voters may feel like their vote really doesn't count as much as it could. Electors could possibly vote opposite of the wishes of the voter. So that's the design of the Electoral College, to protect against poor choices. But we know democracies work today. We are educated voters, or at least we have the opportunity to be educated voters. So, I don't know if we need the safeguard of the electors voting differently than what the people want. Now, this doesn't happen much either. Only a few times in American history have electors voted different. And actually, in 24 states, 26 states, electors are required to vote the way the people voted by state law. I've only found 11 times that electors have voted different than what the people wished, going back to 1796. Now, this is my own research, so I may be incorrect on that because I've seen different numbers, but this I found certainly it has never changed in an election, at least not in recent history. I don't think it's ever changed in an election. Small states like the Electoral College because they disproportionately get more votes than they really should. Now, sometimes people say, well, wait a minute. No, California gets 55 electoral votes. South Dakota gets 3. How are we getting more than we should? Well, let's look at that. California is 55 to our 3, but California has a population of about 38 million, and South Dakota has a population of about 750,000. Now, that's a ratio of 55 electoral votes for 38 million people, or 3 to 750,000. But really, we need to make it 1 to 1 so we can compare apples to oranges. So essentially, the ratio is California's citizens get 1 electoral vote for every 690,000 people. South Dakota, we get 1 electoral vote for every 250,000 people, meaning that each of us really are more powerful than an individual in California. If things were to be fair, really California should get 152 electoral votes to our 3. South Dakota and other small states are more powerful than they would be if we didn't use the Electoral College. People say, well, candidates don't come to South Dakota because we only have 3 electoral votes, and that is true. We don't see a lot of presidential candidates coming to South Dakota, partially because of that, partially because we're typically Republican. So if you're a Republican candidate, maybe you don't need to worry about losing South Dakota. If you're a Democrat, you might feel, I'm not going to win anyway. I need to spend my time elsewhere. But if we change it to popular vote, you know, I understand that all these 38 million are not actual voters, nor are these 750,000. But would you, if you're a candidate, go to South Dakota to try to pick up as many of these 750,000 votes as you could? Or would you go to California to try to pick up more of these 38 million votes? It seems like you would still spend more time in the more populated states and even less time in the less populated states. Having the Electoral College makes the small states more important in a presidential election than they would be if we didn't have it. And keep that in mind. That's actually a very important thing. It's not a direct election. We aren't electing the president. We're actually electing electors who elect the president. And we've already kind of talked about that. And I state that it's a little outdated. Do we really need this anymore? If our reasons were, do we need a safeguard in case the system doesn't work? Well, we know democracies work. It works when we elect senators and representatives and governors and so on. Do we need it here? Is it an outdated system? And some would contend that it is. So why don't we change it? Well, here's why we don't change it. Look at these states. Now remember I said the small states have more say than they should? Well, there's a number of small states. You know, if you have 3 or 4 or 5 electoral votes, you're really a small state, and you're probably benefiting from the fact that we have an electoral college system. Well, the Constitution says that in order to change anything in it, you need a constitutional amendment. Well, the Electoral College is in the Constitution, so it would take a constitutional amendment to get rid of the Electoral College. How does that work? Well, I'm not going to go to it real in depth today. But what I'm going to point out is for a constitutional amendment to be initiated, typically it has to be passed like a 2/3 vote of Congress, 2/3 of the House, 2/3 of the Senate, similar to how a bill becomes a law. However, you know, bills become a law, it's a majority vote, but a similar process, except a 2/3 vote. But that doesn't change the Constitution. That just initiates a change or proposes a change. Then it has to go to the states. And the Constitution says that 3/4 of the states must agree. Well, today, 3/4 of the states is 38 states. So all but 12 states would have to agree to this constitutional change. Well, let's go back here for a second. 12 states. Well, South Dakota wouldn't approve this because we would make ourselves less important in an election. Why would a state vote to make themselves less important? So I don't think you would get South Dakota. You know, I don't think you would get North Dakota or Montana. You know, I don't think we would get Idaho and Wyoming and Alaska and Florida. And if you count up all of these smaller states, not Florida, excuse me, Alaska and Hawaii, Florida, I think, would vote for it. But if you count up all the small states, the ones with 3 or 4 electoral votes, DC doesn't count here because they're not a state. But if you look at those with a 3 or 4 or 5, you're going to see that there are more than those 12. That in order to change the Electoral College, you would need to get the support of 3/4 of the states, which is 38. It seems very unlikely because there's more than 12 states that would become less important in presidential elections if we eliminated the Electoral College. And it seems unlikely that a state would vote to make themselves less important. So it is unlikely that we're going to get rid of the Electoral College. So we have it. We need to understand it. We know that there's some problems with it, but I guess we just have to embrace them. It doesn't look like we're going to change them. And I don't think we're probably going to change the Electoral College. Again, you can go to my PowerPoint. This explains the Electoral College. And this one, done by the same individual, goes over some of the problems with the Electoral College. Both are short videos. Both may be worth your time to take a quick look at. Those are then the problems of our Electoral College.